When Elena Martinez couldn't breathe, her son called for help. The ambulance raced to save her life. But one cruel woman stood in their way, choosing rules over humanity. Some battles are fought in courtrooms, where love faces hatred and truth confronts evil. Before watching full story, comment below from where are you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. David Martinez was having coffee with his mother, Elena, when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning in their quiet neighborhood on Maple Street. Elena, 72 years old, was telling him about her garden when she suddenly stopped talking. "Mom?" David asked, looking up from his newspaper. Elena's face had turned pale. She was holding her chest, breathing in short, quick breaths. Her eyes were wide with fear. I can't breathe," she whispered. David jumped up from his chair. His mother was having trouble breathing, and it was getting worse by the second. He had seen this before when his father had his heart attack 5 years ago. "Mom, stay calm. I'm calling 911 right now." His hands shook as he dialed the emergency number. The operator answered quickly. 911, what's your emergency? My mother is having trouble breathing. She's 72 and has a heart condition. Please send an ambulance to 456 Maple Street. Help is on the way, sir. Stay with her and keep her calm. David sat next to his mother, holding her hand. The ambulance is coming, Mom. You're going to be okay. But Elena's breathing was getting worse. Her lips were turning blue and she was struggling for each breath. David felt helpless watching the woman who raised him fight for her life. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. Finally, David heard the sound of sirens getting closer. The ambulance turned onto their street, its red and blue lights flashing. David ran outside to wave them down. The ambulance was moving fast toward their house when something unbelievable happened. A woman stepped into the street. Margaret Thompson, the head of the Maple Street Homeowners Association, stood directly in front of the ambulance with her arms raised. She was wearing her usual business suit and had that look on her face that everyone in the neighborhood knew and feared. The ambulance had to stop. "What are you doing?" David screamed, running toward her. "My mother is dying." Margaret looked at him with cold eyes. "This ambulance is parked incorrectly. According to HOA rules, emergency vehicles must park in designated areas only. They need to move to the visitor parking section." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you insane? This is a medical emergency." The paramedic jumped out of the ambulance. "Ma'am, we need to get to the patient immediately." "I don't care what you need," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "Rules are rules. The HOA regulations clearly state that all vehicles, including emergency vehicles, must follow our parking guidelines. I will not allow this ambulance to break our community standards." "My mother can't breathe," David pleaded. "She might be having a heart attack." Margaret shrugged. "That's unfortunate, but the rules apply to everyone. No exceptions." The paramedic looked frustrated. "Ma'am, if we waste time moving the ambulance, someone could die." "Then you should have followed the rules from the beginning," Margaret replied. David felt his world falling apart. Inside the house, his mother was fighting for her life, and this woman was worried about parking rules. The paramedic was trying to reason with Margaret, but she wouldn't move. "Please," David begged, tears in his eyes. "I'll pay any fine. I'll fix any violation. Just let them help my mother." "The rules exist for a reason," Margaret said. "If we make exceptions for one person, where does it end? The ambulance needs to park in Section B, visitor parking. It's only 50 yards away. 50 yards might as well be 50 miles when someone is dying." David shouted. Other neighbors started coming out of their houses. Mrs. Johnson, who lived next door, ran over. "Margaret, what are you doing? Let them through. This is HOA business, Dorothy. Stay out of it." More neighbors gathered. Everyone was telling Margaret to move, but she stood firm. The paramedic radioed for backup, but that would take more time. Finally, after 5 minutes that felt like forever, Margaret stepped aside. But she made it clear she wasn't happy about it. "This violation will be reported," she said to David. "You'll receive a fine in the mail." The paramedics rushed into the house. David followed them, his heart pounding. Inside, Elena was barely conscious. Her breathing was so shallow that David could hardly see her chest moving. The paramedics worked quickly, checking her vital signs and giving her oxygen. "We need to get her to the hospital now," one paramedic said. They put Elena on a stretcher and carried her to the ambulance. David climbed in beside her, holding her hand. "You're going to be okay, Mom? We're going to the hospital." Elena squeezed his hand weakly. She tried to speak but couldn't get the words out. At the hospital, Doctors rushed Elena into the emergency room. David had to wait outside, pacing back and forth. A nurse came out after an hour. "Your mother had a severe heart episode," she said. The delay in treatment made it much worse. If the paramedics had reached her even 5 minutes earlier, she might not have suffered as much damage. David felt sick. Those 5 minutes that Margaret had stolen could have saved his mother from permanent damage. Elena survived, but she was weak. The doctors said her heart had been damaged because of the delay in treatment. She would need months of recovery and might never be the same. When David got home that night, he found a letter in his mailbox. It was from the HOA. Violation notice. Improper emergency vehicle parking. Fine, $500. Second violation notice. Disturbance of the peace during ambulance incident. Fine, $300. David stared at the letter in disbelief. Not only had Margaret delayed help for his dying mother, but now she was fining him for it. He called his lawyer, James Rodriguez, the next morning. "Jim, I need your help. Something terrible happened yesterday." David told the whole story. Jim listened carefully, taking notes. "This is outrageous," Jim said. "We need to take legal action. What Margaret did was not just cruel, it was criminal. She endangered your mother's life. Can we really win against the HOA? David, what she did goes way beyond HOA authority. She blocked emergency medical care. That's illegal in every state. We're going to sue her and the HOA for endangering your mother's life and for the medical damages caused by the delay." Over the next few weeks, Jim gathered evidence. He interviewed the paramedics, the neighbors who witnessed the incident, and got medical records from the hospital. The paramedic, Officer Sarah Mills, was willing to testify. "In 20 years of emergency medical work, I've never seen anything like it," she said. "That woman literally blocked us from saving someone's life because of a parking rule." Mrs. Johnson and other neighbors also agreed to testify. "Margaret has always been difficult," Mrs. Johnson said, "but this was evil. Pure evil." The medical evidence was the strongest part of the case. Dr. Peterson, Elena's cardiologist, reviewed her records. "The 5-minute delay in treatment directly caused additional damage to her heart," he wrote in his report. "If treatment had begun immediately, the patient would have had a much better outcome." Jim also discovered something interesting about Margaret. She had blocked other emergency vehicles before, though never with such serious consequences. There were complaints filed with the city about her behavior. Margaret hired an expensive lawyer, Robert Sterling. He argued that Margaret was just doing her job as HOA president and following the rules. "My client was upholding the community standards that all residents agreed to follow," Sterling said in court documents. "The HOA rules clearly state parking regulations for all vehicles. Mrs. Thompson was within her rights to enforce these rules." Sterling also tried to argue that Elena's heart condition would have been serious regardless of the delay. He brought in his own medical expert who claimed that 5 minutes wouldn't have made a difference. But Jim was ready for this. He had done his research on Margaret Thompson. "Your Honor," Jim said during a pretrial hearing, "we will show that Mrs. Thompson has a pattern of abusing her HOA authority. This wasn't about following rules, this was about power and control. She chose to exercise that power even when someone's life was at stake." The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, reporters, and people who had heard about the case. Judge Maria Santos presided over the case. She was known for being fair but tough, especially in cases involving abuse of power. David sat in the front row with Elena, who was still weak but determined to see justice done. Margaret sat on the other side with her lawyer, looking confident. Jim stood up to give his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about what happens when someone puts rules before human life. The defendant, Margaret Thompson, made a choice on that Tuesday morning. When she saw an ambulance rushing to save a dying woman, she chose to block it. She chose parking regulations over a human life. She chose power over compassion." Jim pointed to Elena. "Because of that choice, Elena Martinez suffered permanent damage to her heart. Because of that choice, a son watched his mother nearly die while someone worried about where an ambulance was parked." Sterling gave his opening statement next. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Thompson was simply doing her job. Every community has rules and someone must enforce them. If we make exceptions every time someone claims an emergency, then we have no rules at all. My client did nothing illegal." The first witness was David Martinez. Jim asked him to tell his story. "I watched my mother struggling to breathe," David said, his voice shaking. "I called 911 and help was coming. Then this woman stepped in front of the ambulance. She looked at me, looked at my dying mother through the window, and chose to enforce a parking rule instead of letting them save her life. What did you say to Mrs. Thompson? I begged her. I got on my knees and begged her to let them through. I told her my mother was dying. She said the rules were more important. Sterling tried to make David look emotional and unreliable during cross-examination, but David stayed calm and told the truth. Next came Officer Sarah Mills, the paramedic. In 20 years, I've seen a lot of difficult situations, she testified. But I've never seen someone deliberately block an ambulance to enforce a parking rule. Mrs. Thompson stood in front of our vehicle and refused to move for 5 minutes while a patient was dying. Did you explain to her that this was a medical emergency? Yes, multiple times. She said she didn't care. She said rules were rules. Sterling asked Officer Mills, isn't it true that you could have parked in the designated visitor area? Yes, but that would have taken additional time. Every second counts in a medical emergency. Mrs. Thompson caused a 5-minute delay that could have been deadly. Mrs. Johnson took the stand next. I've lived next to Margaret Thompson for 8 years, she said. She's always been difficult about HOA rules, but what she did that day was monstrous. Can you describe what you saw? I saw the ambulance coming and ran outside. Margaret was standing in the street, blocking them. David was crying, begging her to move. She just stood there with her arms crossed like she was enjoying the power. Other neighbors testified about Margaret's history of using HOA rules to bully people. Mr. Peterson told about how Margaret had his car towed during his wife's funeral because it was parked 12 inches over the line. Mrs. Chin described how Margaret had called the police on a family barbecue because it violated the noise ordinance at 2 p.m. on a Saturday. She uses the HOA rules like a weapon, Mrs. Chin said. She enjoys hurting people. Dr. Peterson, Elena's cardiologist, took the stand to explain the medical impact of the delay. Mrs. Martinez suffered what we call a STEMI, a major heart attack, he explained. In these cases, time is critical. We have a saying, time is muscle. Every minute that passes, more heart muscle dies. Jim showed the jury medical charts. Doctor, what would have happened if Mrs. Martinez had received treatment 5 minutes earlier? She would have had significantly less damage to her heart muscle. The 5-minute delay directly caused additional, permanent damage. She went from having a treatable heart attack to having a heart attack that left her with chronic heart failure. Will she ever fully recover? No. Because of the delay, Mrs. Martinez will have heart problems for the rest of her life. Sterling brought in his own medical expert, Dr. Williams, who tried to argue that the delay didn't matter. But under cross-examination, even Dr. Williams had to admit that earlier treatment would have been better for Elena. Margaret finally took the stand to defend herself. Sterling asked her about her role as HOA president. I take my responsibilities seriously, Margaret said. The residents elected me to enforce the community rules. If I make exceptions, then the rules become meaningless. Why didn't you allow the ambulance to park closer to the house? Because the rules clearly state where vehicles can park. Emergency vehicles are not exempt from our parking regulations. Jim stood up for cross-examination. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Mrs. Thompson, you knew Mrs. Martinez was having a medical emergency, correct? I knew there was some kind of situation, yes. You could see through the window that she was struggling to breathe? I could see there was some kind of medical issue. And you chose to enforce a parking rule instead of letting the paramedics help her immediately? Margaret's lawyer objected, but Judge Santos allowed the question. I chose to uphold the community standards that all residents agreed to follow. Mrs. Thompson, do you have any medical training? No. Are you qualified to determine whether someone is having a life-threatening emergency? No, but you decided that your parking rule was more important than letting medical professionals do their job? Margaret was getting angry. The rules exist for a reason. More important than someone's life? The rules apply to everyone. Jim pressed harder. Mrs. Thompson, if your mother was having a heart attack and someone blocked the ambulance because of a parking rule, how would you feel? Sterling objected, but the damage was done. Margaret's anger was showing, and the jury could see who she really was. Sterling gave his closing argument first. He tried to make Margaret look like a victim of unfair criticism. Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Thompson is not a villain. She's a woman who was trying to do her job. Every community needs rules and someone must enforce them. Yes, the situation was unfortunate, but Mrs. Thompson was acting within her authority as HOA president. But his argument felt weak after everything the jury had heard. Jim stood up for his closing argument. He walked over to Elena, who was sitting in the front row, still weak from her ordeal. "Look at Elena Martinez," he said to the jury. "Look at this woman who nearly died because someone thought a parking rule was more important than her life. Look at her son, David, who had to watch his mother suffer because of one person's cruelty." Jim turned to face Margaret. Margaret Thompson had a choice that morning. When she saw an ambulance rushing to save a life, she could have stepped aside. She could have shown compassion. She could have remembered that she's a human being first and an HOA president second. He walked back to the jury. Instead, she chose power. She chose control. She chose rules over humanity. And because of that choice, Elena Martinez will live with heart damage for the rest of her life. Jim's voice got stronger. "This case isn't really about parking rules or HOA regulations. It's about what kind of people we are. Are we the kind of people who help each other in emergencies? Or are we the kind of people who hide behind rules when someone needs help?" He pointed to Margaret again. Margaret Thompson showed us who she is that day. She's someone who will let an elderly woman suffer to prove a point about parking. She's someone who will block an ambulance to show everyone how much power she has. Don't let her get away with it. Don't let anyone think it's okay to put rules before human life. Elena Martinez deserves justice. David Martinez deserves justice. And our community deserves to know that this kind of cruelty will not be tolerated. The jury went out to deliberate on a Friday afternoon. They came back Monday morning with their decision. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Santos asked. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood up. "In the case of Martinez versus Thompson and Maple Street HOA, we find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." The courtroom erupted in applause. David hugged his mother, and Elena started crying tears of relief. "We award Elena Martinez $500,000 for medical damages and pain and suffering," the foreman continued. "We award David Martinez $100,000 for emotional distress. We also award punitive damages of $1 million against Margaret Thompson for her reckless endangerment of human life." Judge Santos banged her gavel for order. "Mrs. Thompson, your behavior on the day in question was not just cruel, it was criminal. You endangered someone's life to enforce a trivial rule. The jury has spoken and I agree with their decision." She turned to address the whole courtroom. "Let this case be a reminder that no rule, no regulation, no policy is more important than human life. When we forget that, we lose our humanity." After the trial, Margaret Thompson resigned from the HOA and moved away from the neighborhood. The HOA changed their rules to specifically exempt emergency vehicles from all parking regulations. David used part of the settlement money to pay for his mother's ongoing medical care. Elena would never fully recover from her heart attack, but she was alive, and that's what mattered most. The case made national news. People all over the country heard about what happened on Maple Street, and many HOAs changed their policies because of it. 6 months after the trial, David was having coffee with his mother again. Elena was stronger now, though she still got tired easily. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked him. "Every day," David said. "But not with anger anymore. I think about how it showed us who our real neighbors are. Mrs. Johnson, the Chens, all the people who stood up for us. And I think about how justice really does exist, even when it takes time to find it." Elena smiled. "Your father would have been proud of how you fought for me." "I learned from the best," David said. "You taught me that family means everything and you never give up on the people you love." Through the window they could see children playing in the street. No one was worried about HOA rules anymore. The new HOA president, Mrs. Johnson, believed that neighborhoods should be about community, not control. "You know what the best part is?" Elena said. "What's that, Mom?" Margaret thought she had all the power. She thought her rules made her important. But in the end, love was stronger. Truth was stronger. And that's always how it should be. David nodded, holding his mother's hand. Love and truth always win in the end. 1 year later, Maple Street was a different place. The neighbors were closer now, brought together by what they had witnessed and overcome. They had learned that rules without compassion are just cruelty, and that true community comes from caring for each other. Elena Martinez still lived in her house on Maple Street, surrounded by neighbors who would do anything to protect her. Her heart was damaged, but her spirit was strong. She had faced the worst kind of human cruelty and survived it. David visited every day and they still had their morning coffee together. Sometimes they talked about the trial, but mostly they talked about life, family, and the future. The lawsuit had changed more than just their neighborhood. HOAs across the country had adopted new policies protecting emergency responders. Margaret Thompson's cruelty had accidentally made the world a little bit safer for everyone. But the most important change was in the hearts of the people who lived through it. They had learned that when evil shows its face, good people must stand up to it. They had learned that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. And they had learned that in the end, love really is stronger than hate, truth really is stronger than lies, and compassion really is stronger than cruelty. On Maple Street, that lesson lived on every single day. This story reminds us that no rule, no matter how official it seems, is more important than human life and dignity. When we encounter cruelty disguised as authority, we must stand up for what's right. Justice may take time, but it will always find a way to shine through the darkness.